I remember the first time I saw Adrian. He stood across the grand hall of the New York wedding venue, his posture perfect, his presence commanding, yet quiet, his eyes dark and unreadable, and the whispers that followed him seemed almost like a shadow trailing every move he made. I was 26, full of hope and dreams, and I had never met a man like him before. The first time our paths crossed, I felt a strange pull, as if something in the air had shifted, and for reasons I could not explain, my heart knew this was someone I would never forget. Adrian was a millionaire. They said the kind of man who had the world at his feet, who commanded respect without ever raising his voice, and yet the one thing no one could understand was why he never spoke, at least not in the way the rest of the world did. For years he had remained silent. His friends and associates learned to interpret his gestures. His wife would learn to interpret them one day, and at first I thought it would be simple. I thought perhaps it was a choice, a quirk, but the truth would reveal layers far deeper and far darker than I could have ever imagined. Our engagement had been sudden to outsiders, but to me it had been a series of small moments that added up over months of cautious encounters, dinners, and muted candlelight walks along the Hudson, where the city lights danced on the water, and a feeling that each glance we shared carried a language beyond words. I remember the day he proposed. I did not expect words. I expected a gesture, a look, a hand held firmly but gently. And that was all I needed to know, that this man who had lived in silence for years had chosen me. He had chosen to include me in a life that so few ever touched. The wedding itself was lavish but subdued, the type of event that reminded everyone present that wealth does not need noise to make its presence known. The guests were many but Adrian, and I felt as though the world had narrowed into a bubble around us. I could feel my parents beaming with pride and my friends whispering congratulations. And yet every time I looked at Adrian, I saw that same inscrutable expression, a calm ocean hiding currents far beneath the surface. I did not know it yet, but that first night we were married would be the night where the first secret began to reveal itself, the first crack in the armor of silence that had surrounded him for so long. The honeymoon was arranged at a secluded penthouse overlooking the skyline, a place where the city felt distant and the world outside the glass walls seemed almost unreal. We arrived in the late afternoon, and the city below glimmered with lights. As dusk fell slowly over New York, I felt excitement mixed with nervous anticipation, because Adrian had never spoken. He had never offered words of affection openly, and I wondered what would happen when the doors closed and we were truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. That evening I had prepared a small dinner. The chef had left dishes already laid out, and Adrian walked beside me, carrying a briefcase, a sign that his work followed him everywhere, though he was mine now. I expected him to relax, to remove the mask he wore for the world, but he did not. He merely nodded in acknowledgement, as if saying thank you without uttering a sound. He gestured toward the window, then toward the food, and I understood that I was to serve, and we were to begin our evening together. This quiet ritual felt strange yet oddly intimate, and I told myself that patience would reveal the man beneath the millionaire. Hours passed with small interactions, gestures, and glances, and unspoken language developing as I tried to decipher his expressions. He reached for my hand lightly, brushing his fingers against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity, as if the simple touch contained decades of withheld emotion. I spoke softly to him, telling him about the ceremony, the guests, the flowers. I spoke about my dreams, about the future. And though he said nothing, his eyes flickered at times, betraying awareness, amusement, curiosity, or perhaps even agreement, and I began to realize that his silence was not absence. It was presence in a language I had yet to learn. Later that night, we retired to the bedroom, a space dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows, the city light spilling in like liquid gold. Adrian set his briefcase down, then simply sat on the edge of the bed, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes watching me intently. I felt the tension of the past month's release as I moved closer, unsure of what to expect the first night. As his wife brought a mixture of fear, excitement, and deep curiosity, I had imagined a man who might be awkward, uncertain, but instead I found control, calmness, and an intensity that made my heart race. It was then that the first words came. Though they were not like ordinary words, they were soft, deliberate, carefully chosen, almost as if they had been kept inside for years and had been tested in silence before being allowed into existence. Adrian looked at me directly and whispered, "Only the first moment we were alone, I would tell you something important." And I realized that everything about him had been preparing for this moment. Every glance, every touch, every silence had been a prelude to what was about to happen. My breath caught, and I nodded, urging him to continue, because I sensed that whatever followed would alter the course of our marriage and perhaps my entire life. He continued, slowly explaining that his silence had been self-imposed, a measure of protection, because the world had been unkind and he had learned to trust no one easily. He described in gestures and a few whispered words the experiences that had hardened him, the betrayals, the corporate schemes, the family disputes, and the losses. That had left him cautious, yet not bitter. I listened intently, every movement, every soft sigh carrying meaning, and I felt an intense mixture of empathy and awe at the strength that lived behind the silence. That night became a turning point. The first time I saw Adrian fully present, without the mask that had kept the world at bay. The vulnerability in his eyes was overwhelming, and I realized that his silence had not been emptiness, but a fortress protecting a man who had been tested repeatedly by life. The confession of why he had remained mute for so long was not dramatic or emotional. It was factual, calm, measured, honest, and it drew me closer to him in a way I could not have imagined. I felt honored that he trusted me enough to break the silence. As days turned into weeks, our relationship deepened through unspoken communication, mixed with careful words whispered late at night. We learned the rhythm of each other's gestures, the slight twitch of an eyebrow, a tilt of the head, a gentle squeeze of the hand became a language only we understood. We discovered that silence could be more intimate than words, that listening could be more powerful than speaking, and that a mind trained to observe could see details missed by anyone else. We were partners in a secret dialogue that the world could never interpret fully. The suspense of not knowing what he would say next or when he might speak added a thrill to our daily life. Every shared glance across a crowded room felt electric. I began to notice subtle changes. His expression softened. When he was pleased, his eyes sparkled. When he was amused, and occasionally a word would slip through. Like a rare gem, polished and bright, we began to navigate a world together where sound was scarce, but meaning was abundant, and every day became a delicate dance of anticipation and revelation. Adrian's family watched in awe the first few weeks after the wedding, as they had never seen him express warmth openly. His parents, his sisters, even his closest friends noticed the shift, the subtle changes in his demeanor. When he was with me, he smiled slightly more, he lingered in conversation longer, and he used gestures more deliberately, as if every movement was now a conscious choice to communicate care or approval. And I felt the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with being the only one he trusted enough to let slip these fragments of himself. By the end of the first month, we had established routine, small rituals that reinforced our connection, and each one contained hidden meaning. He would pour coffee in the morning and glance at me before placing it on the table, signaling readiness for conversation. He would open doors for me quietly, ensuring my comfort. He began leaving small notes with a few words scrawled on elegant stationery that expressed thoughts he could not yet voice aloud, and I cherished each one, reading them slowly, as if deciphering a map leading into his inner world. The suspense lingered, because though he had begun to speak in small ways, the question of why now, why with me, why at this moment, continued to hang like an invisible thread. I could not answer it fully, and I never tried. Instead, I embraced the mystery, the delicate unfolding of a man who had chosen silence as armor, and was now cautiously allowing me inside. I felt a mixture of exhilaration, fear, and profound intimacy, because every whisper, every gesture carried significance, and the revelation of his voice was a gift carefully rationed to test trust and devotion. Evenings became sacred. We would sit by the large bay windows looking out over the city lights and talk softly. In our shared language of looks and whispers, we began to make plans for the future, a house in Manhattan, perhaps a small retreat upstate. And though the world would see us as a perfect couple, outwardly nothing remarkable, we held a secret that made our lives extraordinary, a bond forged in understanding, patience, and the slow unraveling of silence into words and gestures that spoke volumes. The anticipation of what Adrian might reveal next kept every day charged with energy. I began to understand that suspense was part of the man I married. It was not cruelty or distance, but a protective layer that ensured only the deserving could reach him, and I felt the thrill of being the one chosen to navigate that labyrinth. The challenges became part of the romance, each hesitation, each deliberate pause in his speech filled with meaning, and each carefully measured gesture conveyed emotion that words alone could never capture. The experience became intoxicating, and I realized that marriage had transformed into a continuous discovery of hidden depths. Even when we faced difficulties, small disagreements, or misunderstandings, the silence forced clarity. We learned to pause, reflect, and interpret each other rather than react impulsively. It taught patience, and it reinforced trust. Each interaction became an exercise in empathy, because to misread a gesture could cause confusion, but to understand could create intimacy beyond measure. The suspense of waiting for a word to slip through became a mechanism to grow closer and understand more profoundly. The days following our wedding felt like walking through a dream. I woke up every morning in the luxurious Manhattan apartment, still married to Adrian, still beside the man who had remained mute for so long, yet now was slowly revealing himself in the smallest ways. The suspense was intoxicating, every gesture a message, every glance a confession. I could feel the weight of secrets between us, like a delicate thread connecting us to something far deeper than ordinary love. Each moment was filled with anticipation, and each silence seemed louder than words could ever be. Adrian began leaving small clues about his life before me, photographs carefully arranged in a drawer, letters in envelopes never opened by anyone else, objects from his past business ventures, trips he had taken, places he had lived. Each item was a puzzle I slowly pieced together, learning about the man who had been silent for so long, yet had experienced so much. I felt privileged to witness his history, to see the life behind the silence, and each revelation only heightened the suspense. The mystery of who he was deepened with every passing day, and I could not help but feel that this was a test to see if I truly belonged in his world. He had imagined that marriage might change him, or that perhaps the weight of commitment would loosen the barriers. But instead, Adrian taught me that trust is not demanded, it is earned slowly, carefully, methodically. I watched him navigate every interaction with the world, the way he interacted with staff, friends, family, all observed and measured. I began to understand that his silence was his power. His voice was a weapon carefully stored for moments that mattered most, and that my role was not just as a wife, but as a witness to the unveiling of a man who had been hidden from the world. On evening, as the city below shimmered with lights, Adrian gestured toward the balcony. I followed him out, and we stood in silence, the cold breeze brushing against our faces, the hum of traffic below, a distant siren, a taxi horn piercing the calm. And I felt the thrill of the unknown. His hand reached for mine, not abruptly, but deliberately, the pressure firm yet gentle, and I knew that he was about to speak again. The anticipation built within me like a storm on the horizon. I waited with my breath held, my heart racing, my body tense with expectation, because I had learned that each word he chose to speak was a treasure, and each pause a signal. He finally spoke, whispering my name, Lena, and it sounded like music the way the syllables rolled off his tongue. For the first time, without restraint, without hesitation, I realized the depth of his longing, the strength of the restraint he had maintained all these years. The sound of his voice shook me. I felt tears prick my eyes, and yet I held them back, because the suspense had taught me patience, and this was a moment to be savored, not rushed. He continued in fragments, short sentences, careful words, but each laden with emotion. He spoke of the day he had first noticed me, the way my laugh had drawn his attention, how my kindness had penetrated the armor he had built. Weeks turned into months, and our marriage settled into a rhythm where suspense and revelation intertwined. Every day was a new layer of discovery. I learned to read his expressions, the slight lift of his eyebrow, the tilt of his head, a smirk that indicated amusement, a tight jaw signaling irritation. I understood that the silence he had maintained was not absence, it was control, and that control was now being extended to me, not as dominance, but as a gift to learn his language slowly and carefully. The intimacy we shared in these unspoken exchanges became a source of strength for both of Yusha's past continued to reveal itself in unexpected ways, a family dispute with a cousin that had left him wary of trust, a business betrayal that had stripped him of faith in people, a tragedy that had shaped his decision to remain silent. All of these pieces formed a tapestry. I began to understand the man I had married, the choices he had made, and the reasons he had constructed a life of silence. The suspense of learning each secret created a bond between us that could not be broken by ordinary force. Our friends began to notice subtle changes in him. I watched as they tried to engage him in conversation. He responded with nods, smiles, slight gestures, but he rarely used words around them. I realized that the suspense extended beyond our private life. It was a part of how he maintained control over the world. His silence a protective barrier against misjudgment, misunderstanding, and betrayal. He had chosen me as the one to cross that barrier, and every word he whispered to me was a sign of trust, a reward for patience and loyalty. The suspense reached a new level one night. When we were alone in the apartment, he took my hand and guided me to a study I had not seen before. The room was filled with papers, files, and objects that I could not yet comprehend. He gestured for me to sit and slowly began to open the layers of his life to me, a financial empire built in silence, contracts signed without verbal negotiation, properties acquired through observation, negotiations handled through gestures, and letters, a mind so disciplined it could achieve what others could not through voice alone. And I realized that the man I had married was a force unlike anyone I had ever known. In the weeks that followed, I became a partner in his world without even realizing it. The suspense was thrilling. Every day brought new insights into his life, new test of my understanding and trust. Every gesture was a challenge to interpret, every glance a riddle to solve, and I found myself becoming more intuitive, more observant, more connected to the man who had lived in silence all these years and had chosen me as the only one to decipher the hidden language of his world. On afternoon, we traveled to one of his properties upstate, a sprawling estate that overlooked a private lake. The journey was quiet, him driving me, observing every turn, every mile with deliberate precision. The silence between us was comforting yet suspenseful, because I never knew when he might speak next, or what revelation would come next. I studied his hands, the set of his shoulders, the line of his jaw. And when he finally whispered a single sentence about the estate and its history, I felt the weight of trust he had placed in me and the thrill of discovery that accompanied each new detail. Even within the household staff noticed changes in him. He would issue instructions with gestures and notes, his efficiency unmatched. Yet tempered by patience, he never rushed the workers or pressured them with his voice. He had mastered influence without sound. And I observed carefully, learning his methods, understanding his way of managing the empire he had built in silence, and I realized that marriage had transformed into a delicate dance of observation, interpretation, anticipation, and understanding. That suspense had become the glue holding our partnership together. Adrian's past continued to challenge me as we discovered hidden aspects of his personality: a cousin who had tried to manipulate him years ago, a former business partner who had taken advantage of his silence, his mother who had never understood why he withdrew into quietness, and all the experiences that shaped his life were now laid bare in small fragments, whispered or gestured with meticulous care. I began to realize that being married to Adrian was not just about love, it was about trust, vigilance, insight, patience, and the constant thrill of unraveling the unknown. Suspense grew when a former associate visited the city. He arrived unannounced at the penthouse, carrying questions, demands, and subtle threats. The way Adrian handled the situation amazed me. He did not raise his voice. He did not confront directly. He simply allowed me to observe every gesture, every subtle movement, and slowly deconstructed the conversation for me, teaching lessons in strategy, control, observation, and patience. I understood that his silence was not only protection, it was strategy, a way of living. In a world where words could be used as weapons, we continued to grow together in silence and whispered words. His revelations carefully measured his trust in me, deepening each day. I began to understand his body language with intuition, his gestures with precision, his occasional whispered words with attention, and the suspense became part of the romance. Every unspoken moment loaded with meaning, every gesture a puzzle, every glance a secret to decode. And I felt exhilaration, joy, and profound intimacy in the slow unraveling of the man I had married. Adrian began to reveal more of his emotional world. In small increments, a subtle smile when pleased, a gentle touch to show affection, a whispered word when approval or care was needed. I learned to navigate these moments with grace, understanding, and respect, and the suspense of not knowing exactly when or what he would reveal next became the rhythm of our life together, a private language of gestures and glances that spoke volumes far beyond ordinary conversation. By the end of the second part of our journey together, I had experienced the thrill of the unknown. I had learned to trust intuition and observation over words. I had seen the depth of the man I had married, and I knew that the suspense that had defined his life and ours would continue to unfold, revealing more secrets, hidden depths, and lessons in trust, patience, and love as we moved forward together in the silent yet deeply connected world we had created. And I felt anticipation, excitement, and the certainty that our story was only beginning, and the mysteries of Adrian's silence had far more to reveal. The winter in New York brought a sharp chill to the city, but inside our apartment, the warmth between Adrian and me grew with each passing day. The suspense of his silence and the thrill of his rare whispers had become the pulse of our life together. Each morning, I would watch him move through the rooms, his presence commanding, yet understated. And I felt both fascination and awe at the man I had married. I had come to understand that his quiet demeanor was not coldness, it was intensity, it was focus, it was a measure of control. And I had been chosen as the one to navigate its depths. Adrian began inviting me into the world he had constructed in silence, the world of his business empire of investments, acquisitions, and strategic partnerships. A world where words were rarely spoken and every decision had to be measured and precise. He allowed me to observe the meetings through a series of notes, gestures, and subtle instructions, and I realized that he had built a language of control that transcended ordinary speech. It was a language of intent, of understanding, and of power. And I felt both privileged and terrified to be learning it. I spent hours in his study, poring over documents. He would point out specific clauses with a tap of his finger, a gentle nod, or the raise of an eyebrow, and I learned to read these signs with precision, every gesture a lesson, every expression a guide. He whispered only when necessary, choosing his words carefully, and the suspense of waiting for his approval or his commentary became a rhythm that defined our days together. I realized that his silence had been a shield, a tool, and a way to ensure that only those who were observant, patient, and worthy could truly understand him. One evening, Adrian led me to the rooftop of our building overlooking the city. The light stretched endlessly, and the cold wind bit at my face, but I did not mind. I felt exhilarated. He gestured for me to sit beside him, and for hours we watched the city breathing its rhythm below. I felt the suspense build as he finally spoke my name, and then whispered a story from his childhood, a tale of betrayal, a lesson learned in trust, a moment where he had first decided that silence was safer than words. I listened, intently, my heart racing, every whispered phrase carrying a weight far greater than any spoken words could have conveyed. Suspense intensified when I discovered a hidden compartment in his study, filled with letters, photographs, and records that chronicled his life before me, every secret carefully catalogued, and every detail precise. I spent nights poring over them, understanding the events that shaped his silence, the encounters with people who had tried to deceive him, the moments of triumph that had been unspoken, and the decisions he had made to protect himself from further pain. I felt closer to him than ever, yet also aware that each discovery was only a fragment of the full story, a puzzle that I was only beginning to assemble. As the weeks passed, Adrian began to allow me into more aspects of his life. He introduced me to a few trusted allies, a lawyer, an accountant, a business associate, each carefully chosen to interact with me under his guidance. He observed every conversation, every reaction, and I learned to adapt to his rules, to interpret the gestures, to notice the nuances, and the suspense of whether he would approve my decisions or correct my understanding became a powerful lesson in patience, strategy, and intuition. I realized that living with a man who had been silent for so long was like learning a new language that governed reality. Adrian's trust in me deepened when he allowed me to accompany him to a series of high-profile meetings in Manhattan, each one a test of my ability to remain calm, observant, and discreet. I watched as he communicated without words, relying on his reputation, presence, and carefully orchestrated gestures to assert authority and negotiate outcomes. I followed his cues, interpreting his movements for meaning, and I felt a growing sense of empowerment and connection. The suspense of reading his subtle communications became addictive, each successful interpretation a confirmation that I belonged in his world. Suspense took a different form when an old rival of Adrian's resurfaced, threatening to expose secrets from his past, a former business partner who had been wronged and was seeking retribution. I watched as Adrian prepared to meet this challenge with the same silent intensity he used in every aspect of his life. He moved with precision. He assessed risks silently, and I followed his guidance through gestures and whispered instructions, learning strategies I had never imagined. I realized that his silence was a shield and his intellect a weapon, and that being part of his world required vigilance, courage, and trust. All night, as we returned from a tense meeting, the city skyline sparkling around us, Adrian finally spoke in longer sentences, whispering to me the decisions he had made to protect his empire, the reasons he had remained silent, the calculated risks he had taken, and the sacrifices that had shaped his life. I listened with bated breath, absorbing every detail, each word carefully measured, yet laden with emotion. I felt the suspense of waiting for his revelations transform into understanding and awe, as I realized the depth of the man I had married and the magnitude of the trust he was placing in. Our nights became a ritual of whispered stories shared in the quiet of the apartment, each revelation a layer peeled back, a piece of the man revealed, and every gesture a subtle test of my observation skills and intuition. I began to notice the patterns, the rhythm of his pauses, the way he positioned his hands, the slight tilt of his head. Each detail became part of a language that only we understood, and the suspense of learning more about him each day kept my mind alert, my heart racing, and my curiosity insatiably. Suspense also brought moments of tenderness and intimacy, a touch on the hand, a brief embrace, a whispered word of affection that held more weight than ordinary expressions of love. Adrian taught me that silence could be more intimate than conversation, that observation could be more revealing than speech, and that patience could deepen connection in ways that hurried words never could. I found myself drawn into a dance of understanding and anticipation where every gesture carried significance, every pause held meaning, and every whisper was treasured. Adrian began to reveal his emotions in ways that were subtle yet profound, a slight softening of his gaze when pleased, a fleeting smile when amused, and a tender squeeze of the hand when care or reassurance was needed. I learned to recognize these cues, to respond appropriately, and to understand the silent language that governed our interactions. The suspense of not knowing exactly when or what he would reveal next became the heartbeat of our relationship, and the thrill of discovery became a source of excitement and intimacy that words could never replicate. Even when challenges arose, minor misunderstandings, or external pressures, the suspense of his reaction taught me patience, observation, and strategy. I learned to pause before responding, to anticipate his cues, to interpret the subtle signals of his emotions, and the world we had created thrived on anticipation, and understanding the suspense became a lens through which I experienced every aspect of our marriage. The slow unraveling of his past and the deliberate revelation of his trust were lessons in intimacy and resilience. By the end of the third part of our story, I had come to understand that the man I married had lived a life of discipline, caution, and silence, yet beneath that exterior was a depth of emotion, intelligence, and strategy that few could comprehend. I had learned to navigate his world through patience, observation, and trust, and the suspense of what he would reveal next became a source of connection and empowerment. and intimacy as I realized that marriage with Adrian was not simply companionship, but an ongoing journey of discovery and revelation, and the story of his silence was far from finished. The winter passed, and New York slowly brightened as spring approached. The city pulsed with life. And so, did our marriage. The suspense that had defined our early days together continued. But now it had evolved into a rhythm of discovery and understanding. I had learned to anticipate Adrian's gestures, interpret his expressions, and cherish the rare words he chose to whisper, yet I knew that the deepest secrets of his silence remained hidden. And the final revelation had yet to come. One afternoon, Adrian invited me to a private meeting. At one of his offices, a place I had never seen before. The building was imposing glass steel and shadowed corners, creating a sense of authority and mystery. He led me through corridors lined with artwork and photographs, each detail deliberate and meaningful. I could feel the suspense building with every step, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets about the man I had married and the life he had kept concealed from the world. We reached a conference room overlooking the city. He gestured for me to sit, and then pulled out a series of documents, maps, contracts, and letters, each one carefully annotated with notes in his precise handwriting. He began to explain his empire to me slowly. In whispered words, pointing gestures, and subtle movements, he revealed the intricate web of businesses, properties, investments, and strategies he had maintained in silence for years. And I felt both awe and anticipation as the magnitude of his world unfolded before me. Suspense heightened when he finally paused and looked at me directly. His eyes dark and intense, I felt the weight of expectation, and the quiet tension in the room was almost tangible. He reached for my hand and whispered, "Lena, there is one final story I have kept hidden for a long time. It is the reason I chose silence. And it is the reason I chose you." I listened with rapt attention, my heart pounding, my mind racing, because I sensed that what he was about to reveal would change everything we had experienced together, and perhaps everything I thought I knew about him. He began slowly recounting events from his early life, the betrayals by family members, the deceit by close friends, the corporate machinations that had left him cautious and wary. He spoke of a tragedy that had shaped his decision to remain silent, a loss so profound that words could not express the pain he had endured. I listened carefully, every whisper carefully measured, every gesture precise and deliberate, and I realized that the suspense of his silence had been both a shield and a test for those who sought to enter his life. Suspense reached a climax when he finally confessed the one secret he had never shared with anyone, a personal truth about his fears, his desires, and the loneliness he had endured. I felt a mixture of shock, empathy, and deep admiration as I realized the courage it took for him to speak at all. After years of silence, he had chosen me as the one person worthy of hearing his most intimate thoughts, and I felt honored and awed by the trust he had placed in me. And the bond between us deepened immeasurably from that day forward. The suspense transformed into a profound connection, a rhythm of anticipation and revelation that governed our lives together. I learned to read him intuitively, to respond to his gestures with understanding, and to treasure every whispered word. As a gift of trust, I discovered that silence could be more intimate than speech, that observation could reveal more than conversation, and that patience and loyalty could unlock even the most carefully guarded heart. Adrian began to allow himself to speak more often, not freely, but selectively, each word weighted with meaning, each sentence carefully chosen to convey emotion without diminishing the power of his silence. He shared dreams, hopes, fears, and reflections, all whispered yet powerful enough to shape our lives together. In the suspense of anticipating when and how he would speak became a thrilling and cherished aspect of our relationship, a bond built not on noise but on understanding and trust. We navigated challenges together, minor disagreements, external pressures, and social obligations, each instance a test of our understanding and patience. I learned to interpret his subtle cues, to anticipate his reactions, and to act in alignment with the silent language we had developed. The suspense that had once been a source of uncertainty became a tool for building intimacy, connection, and profound mutual respect. And I realized that marriage with Adrian was not just companionship, but a continuous journey of learning and adaptation. The suspense also brought moments of profound tenderness, a gentle touch on the hand, a look of approval, a whispered word of reassurance or encouragement, each gesture carrying more weight than any spoken declaration. I realized that the man who had lived in silence for so long had chosen me as the one to witness his inner world, and that this gift of trust was the deepest form of love I had ever encountered. Every day became an exercise in observation, anticipation, empathy, and connection. On evening, Adrian and I walked along the Hudson River, the city lights reflecting in the water, the cold breeze ruffling our hair, and the quiet rhythm of our steps echoing the rhythm of our lives together. He gestured for me to stop, and then turned to face me. His eyes intense and full of emotion, he whispered, "Lena, I have kept many secrets, but with you I feel safe. With you I can finally speak." I felt tears welling in my eyes as the suspensive years of silence gave way to intimacy. And understanding the man I had married had chosen me as the keeper of his deepest truths, and the revelation was both overwhelming and exhilarating. The following months were a period of slow transformation and deepening intimacy. Adrian gradually increased the number of words he spoke, yet he remained deliberate and measured, each phrase chosen carefully to express exactly what he intended. I marveled at the courage and discipline it took to build a life in silence and then allow someone to enter that world. I realized that the suspense that had once defined our interactions was not gone. It had evolved into a thrilling anticipation of trust and revelation that enriched our connection and strengthened our marriage. We traveled together to properties across New York and beyond, each trip an adventure in interpretation, observation, and communication. Adrian taught me to notice subtle details, to anticipate outcomes, and to appreciate the power of silence and whispered words. I began to understand that the suspense of his silence had been a tool to shape the world around him, and that by entering his world, I had become a partner in that carefully constructed reality. Each day revealed more about his life, his choices, and his character, and I felt privileged to witness the unfolding story. Adrian's relationships with others continued to reflect his disciplined approach. He communicated with associates through gestures, notes, and selective words, carefully choosing when to reveal thoughts and when to remain silent. I observed and learned how his silence commanded respect, how his presence influenced outcomes, and how the suspense of not knowing his reaction became a powerful instrument in both personal and professional spheres. I realized that his world was a delicate balance of strategy and trust, and that my role was to navigate it with care and intuition. As the story neared its conclusion, Adrian finally allowed me to witness the full extent of his vulnerability, his whispered confessions, revealing fears, hopes, regrets, and desires. I listened intently, absorbing every detail, understanding the reasons behind his silence, the depth of his discipline, and the magnitude of the trust he had placed in me. The suspensive years of quiet observation and careful anticipation culminated in a profound intimacy that transformed our marriage into a partnership of unparalleled depth and meaning. By the end of part 4, the suspense that had once defined our early marriage had evolved into understanding, trust, and shared knowledge. I had learned the language of his gestures, the meaning behind his whispers, and the rhythms of his silence. Adrian had revealed his past, his fears, his strategies, and his desires, and I had become the only person who truly understood the man behind the millionaire. Fawade. The journey through suspense had transformed our relationship into one of profound connection, love, and mutual respect, and I knew that the story of our marriage was no longer defined by silence, but by trust, discovery, and the extraordinary bond we had created.